Around 1200 BC, the ancient world ended. Every major civilization collapsed simultaneously. The Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, the great trading cities of the Levant. 33 palace centers destroyed in 50 years. The Bronze Age collapse. Egypt survived. While every other civilization in the eastern Mediterranean fell, Egypt, the oldest, the wealthiest, the most powerful, held on. Ramesses III fought off the Sea Peoples in what he claimed was a great triumph. Egypt kept its territory, its priesthood, its trade routes, its identity. Every other civilization crumbled, and Egypt did not. And for 200 years after the Bronze Age collapse, historians essentially agreed, Egypt made it through. Egypt survived, except it did not. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. Because what happened to Egypt after the Bronze Age collapse was not a triumph. It was a slow-motion collapse, so gradual, so internal, so invisible from the outside, that it took historians centuries to recognize it for what it was. By the time Egypt was finally conquered, first by the Libyans, then the Nubians, then the Assyrians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, it had been hollowing out from the inside for 300 years. The real reason Egypt collapsed had nothing to do with foreign invasion. It was already happening before any outsider arrived. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, then it destroyed itself. To understand why Egypt collapsed, you need to understand why it survived. Egypt's survival of the Bronze Age collapse was not a miracle. It was geography. The Nile was not like the trade networks that sustained the Hittites or the Mycenaeans. Those civilizations depended on complex interconnected supply chains, tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, grain from Egypt. When those chains broke, those civilizations had nothing to fall back on. Egypt had the Nile. The Nile flooded every year. It deposited rich silt. Crops grew. The food supply was not dependent on a fragile international trading system. It was built into the geography of the land itself. This is why Egypt could feed the Hittites during the Bronze Age collapse when the Hittites were starving. Egypt's agricultural base was practically indestructible. The Nile flooded every year. Egypt could always eat. This was Egypt's superpower, and its curse. But here is what they do not tell you in history class. Egypt's survival of the Bronze Age collapse came at a price, a hidden price that would not become visible for generations. To fight off the Sea Peoples, Ramesses III had to spend massively. Egypt's treasury had been strained by decades of warfare before the Sea Peoples even arrived. Ramesses II's campaigns against the Hittites, the ongoing management of the Nubian gold supply, the enormous temple-building programs that every pharaoh used to demonstrate divine authority. By the time Ramesses III faced the Sea Peoples, Egypt was already running a deficit. He won the battle, but winning cost more than Egypt could afford. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign. The workers at Deir el-Medina went on strike. Deir el-Medina was the village of the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were skilled workers, painters, sculptors, carpenters, some of the most privileged laborers in Egypt, guaranteed a wage by the state. Rations of grain, fish, vegetables, and pottery paid monthly by the royal treasury. In the 29th year of Ramesses III, the rations did not come. They waited. Nothing. They sent word to the officials. Nothing. Finally, the workers walked off the job and staged a sit-in protest outside the administrative compound at the Valley of the Kings. This is the first recorded labor strike in human history, documented in the Deir el-Medina papyri, sitting in a museum in Turin, Italy right now. What they wrote in their records is extraordinary. They did not claim injustice. They did not accuse the pharaoh of malice. They simply wrote that they were hungry, that the rations had not come, that the granaries were empty. The granaries of the most powerful nation on earth were empty. Here is what I think is the most important question this raises. Egypt had survived 2,000 years of floods, famines, and invasions. The state had always provided, and now the state could not pay its own craftsmen. What does it mean when a civilization that has worked for 2,000 years simply stops working? Tell me what you think. The rations eventually came, borrowed from nearby temples, a patch on a widening crack. But the strike happened again the following month, and the month after that. The system was breaking down, and the pharaoh who had claimed a great military triumph could not keep his own workers fed. What was actually happening to Egypt after the Bronze Age collapse can be understood through 4 converging crises, none of them caused by foreign invasion, all of them self-inflicted or geographic. Evidence piece 1. The loss of the Nubian gold. Egypt's wealth, real, tangible, material wealth, came from the gold mines of Nubia in the south. The gold paid for the armies, the temples, the grain imports during bad years, the diplomatic gifts that maintained Egypt's relationships with neighboring powers. When Egypt controlled Nubia, Egypt was wealthy. When Egypt lost control of Nubia, which happened gradually over the course of the new kingdom's decline, Egypt lost its economic foundation. By the end of the 20th dynasty, Egypt had effectively lost control of the Nubian gold routes. The treasury dried up. The rations stopped. The strike at Deir el-Medina was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom. The gold was gone. Everything else followed. Evidence piece 2. The division of power between the pharaoh and the priests. The pharaohs of the new kingdom had made a fateful bargain with the priests of Amun at Karnak. Every military campaign, every great victory, was attributed to Amun. Every act of gratitude was expressed with land grants and temple endowments. Over centuries, the priests of Amun accumulated enormous wealth and power, land, labor, tax exemptions, economic independence. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the priests of Amun at Karnak controlled more agricultural land than the pharaoh himself. The high priest of Amun had effectively become a parallel power, and in the 21st dynasty, the high priest did not merely parallel the pharaoh, he replaced him. Egypt split into two, a pharaoh ruling the north from Tanis, and the high priest of Amun ruling the south from Thebes, not by conquest, by administrative drift. Evidence piece 3, the Wenamun papyrus. Around 1070 BC, an Egyptian official named Wenamun was sent to Lebanon to purchase cedar wood for the sacred bark of Amun. The mission that would once have been a routine diplomatic exercise, Egypt asking, trading partners complying, became a humiliating ordeal. The ruler of Byblos kept Wenamun waiting for months, refused to give the wood on credit, demanded cash payment in advance, compared Egypt unfavorably to the great powers of the past. Wenamun, representative of the once mighty Egypt, was treated as a petitioner from a second-rate state. He eventually got his wood. But the papyrus he left behind, discovered in Egypt in 1890, now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, reads like a diplomatic disaster. Egypt had gone from commanding to begging within 2 generations of the Bronze Age collapse. Evidence piece 4, the climate and the Nile. Egypt's great geographic advantage, the reliable Nile flood, began to fail. Modern paleoclimatological research has shown that the period between approximately 1100 and 900 BC saw repeated failures of the Nile inundation. Low floods meant low crop yields. The agricultural surplus that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years became unreliable. The foundation of Egypt's survival was cracking from below. So what actually collapsed Egypt? Not the Sea Peoples. Egypt fought them off. Not foreign invasion. That came later, and to a state that had already been hollowed out. Not even the Bronze Age collapse itself. Egypt survived that. What collapsed Egypt was the interaction of all 4 crises simultaneously. The loss of Nubian gold starved the treasury. The empty treasury could no longer pay the army or the workers or the grain imports. The priests of Amun, who had been accumulating power for centuries, filled the vacuum left by a weakening pharaoh. The split between north and south made it impossible to respond to challenges as a unified state. And when the Nile floods became unreliable, the agricultural surplus that had always cushioned Egypt from crisis was no longer guaranteed. Each crisis made the others worse. The system that had worked for 3,000 years stopped working, not because of one dramatic blow, but because of a cascade of mutually reinforcing failures happening simultaneously. Sound familiar? It is the same logic as the Bronze Age collapse itself. A complex system pushed past its threshold of stress, failing suddenly and completely. But in Egypt's case, the collapse was in slow motion. It took 300 years instead of 50. And because it was slow, because each individual crisis looked manageable from the inside, no pharaoh ever fully understood what was happening. Egypt lasted 3,000 years. The Roman Empire lasted about 500. The United States has existed for 250. What does it take to build something that lasts 3,000 years? And what does it mean that even that was not enough? I want to know what you think. The historians who study this call it the Third Intermediate Period, the 500 years from approximately 1070 to 664 BC, when Egypt was divided, dominated, and eventually conquered by successive foreign powers. Not because it was weak, but because the internal systems that had made it strong for 3,000 years had quietly failed. We started with the question everyone asks about ancient Egypt: why did it collapse? The answer is not the one you were taught. It was not the Sea Peoples. It was not the Bronze Age collapse. It was not a single dramatic event. No burning, no invasion, no catastrophic battle that ended everything. It was the granaries running empty in the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign. It was the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina sitting down in protest because they were hungry. It was Wenamun being kept waiting in Byblos, while the ruler there reminded him that Egypt was no longer what it once was. It was priests who had become more powerful than pharaohs, and a Nile that had become less reliable than it used to be, and a treasury that had been paying for 3,000 years of magnificence, and finally ran out. Egypt did not fall because it was defeated. Egypt fell because it had been paying the cost of being Egypt for 3,000 years, and eventually, the bill came due. What came after is one of the strangest stories in all of human history. including the extraordinary irony that the people Egypt had spent 3,000 years extracting gold from, the Nubians of Kush, eventually marched north and became Egypt's pharaohs. The colonized became the rulers. Subscribe to Arcana Historia before you leave, because that story is already waiting.